Welcome everyone to our Fireside Chat series. The Fireside Chat is our public open forum for discussing topics and issues that are near and dear to us. So thank you for being a part of it. Today's topic is urban planning, the secret weapon for battling climate change. My name is Jason Georgiorian, and I'm a principal at LGA Architecture, and I'll be your moderator. Last month, we had a chat on connecting to the outdoors and preserving our natural environment in state parks. And now we're gonna shift focus and look at our cultural urban centers and their impact on environmental change. More than half the people in the world live in urban areas, and that number is expected to continue to grow to 2/3 of the world's population in the next couple of decades. And our cities, relatively to the Earth's surface, they take up a small percentage of area on the Earth, but their environmental and social impacts are enormous. Cities account for 70% of carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions. And that greenhouse gas effect is a leading cause of global warming. So as temperatures are rising each year, and we see that through the science and what's going on around us. And this is felt most in our cities, where temperatures are probably conservatively already 1 to 7 degrees warmer than nearby non-urban areas. So there's potential dangers from global warming that can lead to systematic changes. We've heard of these, such as power outages, flooding, disease, economic downturns. So I just threw a bunch of data out at you. You probably read some of this yourself. And all this points to cities as a major cause of. However, what we hope to learn today, and we're excited to hear, is how our cities are also the best solution too. There is not a silver bullet out there, but the cities have the capacity to lead the way on mitigating the issues around climate change. And we'll hear from a great group of urban planning experts that we have here, and we'll gain insight and learn from them the best planning strategies for our cities. So before I turn it over to Craig to get started with the introductions, just a little bit of webinar logistics. Everyone on the webinar is muted. However, there's a Q&A button. Please ask questions at any time. We'll do our best to get those answered for you. In addition, we're being recorded. So sometime next week, you're gonna see an email with a link to this recording. In addition, there'll be a link to our other Fireside Chats and webinars. So please take a look. We encourage you to do so, and please let us know what you think. We love to hear feedback. So Craig, if you want to get us kicked off with the introductions.
Great, thank you very much. We are so excited to have this panel here today, and I'm going to go ahead and give them a quick introduction, and then we're going to jump right into questions because I know you want to hear from them and not from me. But the first person I want to introduce is Bruce Race. Dr. Race is a professor at the Gerald D. Hines School of Architecture and Design and director of University of Houston's Center for Sustainability and Resilience. Bruce Race, FAIA, FAICP, PhD, is one of very few architecture and urban planning professionals in the United States that have been elected to fellowship by both AIA and the American Institute of Certified Planners. He's a principal and founder of RACESTUDIO, responsible for all aspects of project planning, design, and delivery. And since founding RACESTUDIO in Berkeley in 1994, his projects have received 33 design and planning awards, including 9 national awards. Welcome, Bruce. Samantha Chundur is a designer and planner with 20 years of experience in architecture, planning, and urban design in the US, Asia, Middle East, Europe, and Latin America. Her work ranges from international master planning, regional planning, to neighborhood design and development standards, with an emphasis on mixed use, transit-oriented development, and low-carbon sustainable communities. She co-authored a book, Emerald Cities, Planning for Smart and Green China, a publication of key concepts, principles, and metrics for planning and designing sustainable communities in China. Samantha did her undergraduate work in architecture from India and graduate studies in planning and urban development from the University of Cincinnati and Erasmus University in the Netherlands. She's a member of American Institute of Certified Planners, a lead accredited professional, and a registered architect and planner in India. Welcome, Samantha. And Mike Howe, AICP lead GA, is the long-range planning section manager and urban design coordinator for the City of Las Vegas Department of Planning, where he's worked in both long-range and current planning for more than 15 years. The focus of his work is on the research and design of healthy communities and the development of policies and public projects that increase the quality of life in the City of Las Vegas. He holds an undergraduate degree in political science and a Master of Architecture, both from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and is a lead green associate with USGBC. When not at work, Mike enjoys establishing the modern to his modern century home with his wife and 2 sons. Mike, thanks for joining us. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. I think we're going to start with Samantha. And so the first question is, what is your favorite urban environment, and what can we learn from it?
Amsterdam. You know, one of my favorite urban environments is Amsterdam because it incorporates many of the sustainable design strategies that we talk about regarding climate change. It has compact development, it is mixed use, it prioritizes walkability, bikeability, and transit over cars. And it does that in a built environment that weaves in a variety of open spaces and experiences, and it has great street vitality. You know, it goes without saying that, you know, it's one of the most bike-friendly cities in the world. You know, I remember when I was studying in the Netherlands, you know, it opened my eyes to how cities can be, you know, especially with regard to creating an environment that encourages non-vehicular modes of transportation. And, you know, the streets are designed to make biking safe and walking safe. And therefore, you know, they have a really large mode share. You know, I believe almost 60% of all trips in Amsterdam happen by walk or bike. And in addition to that, you know, the city also has a really ambitious green agenda. You know, it has set targets and policies to combat climate change and to reduce carbon emissions. And it covers like a huge range of, you know, topics. You know, it ranges from clean energy for transportation. They have incentives, you know, to increase electric vehicles, you know, green buildings, sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy sources, and also green space. And, you know, I think by 2030, the aim for the city, the target they've set is to be emission-free from all forms of transportation. You know, in short, you know, my favorite urban environment is the one that prioritizes how we move through cities rather than how cars move through cities. You know, my favorite urban environment is one that provides multiple options for people to move around in an efficient, fast, and, you know, simple manner to access, you know, things that we do in our daily lives. You know, we access jobs, services, and amenities. You know, fundamentally, you know, how we navigate through our cities impacts not only emissions and climate change, but, you know, it impacts our health and wellness. So urban environments that are more livable and high quality are ones that are designed for people.
Great, thank you. Wow. I've unfortunately never been to Amsterdam, so now it's going to be on the bucket list. So
yeah, you should.
Thank you. All
That
right,
was
Bruce.
chapter 26.
Yeah. Bruce, to flip that same question over to you.
Well, you know, I love watering holes, you know, and so part of it, if I'm going to go a bit more granular in this, because you need a proper 10-minute walk to a watering hole. Right. And that encapsulates all the things that Samantha has been, you know, has talked about in a great city. And so, and that's what when I think about a city and how I remember it, because of it's not just the social piece of it, but it's really ends up being one of these, it has that social gravity that really helps you define a community. And so it's just one of the things I love about cities. You know, part of it is, it's because it's the place you walk, right? And it helps, it does define a neighborhood. It's one of those defining features for a neighborhood. In the United States, we organize our cities around schools and grocery stores. It's all about driving. And so, in a proper watering hole, not much driving. It's a lot about the neighborhood. And so what can you learn from that environment? It's best enjoyed at 250 feet a minute. And it's pretty carbon neutral, right? If it's a proper pub.
That's great. Thank you so much. Mike, I'm going to give you a chance to answer that same question.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a blend. I guess I get to take advantage of being the last of the first two great minds there. When I think of the places, initially first thought was of like specific cities that I enjoy. And I tend to have a Euro bent. I like Luxembourg, but even Vancouver. But when I looked at the question again, it was urban environments. And I have to say, hands down, my favorite urban environment, when done correctly, is a public plaza. And it's something that's just, I think, more culturally norm for Europe, but we still see them in the West. Santa Fe, some of the older colonial cities, San Antonio. And what's unique about it is it's that civic monumentalism that somehow when they started, they said first step is, as a community, we're going to build a space for everybody to do social gatherings. And then from there, everything follows. You'd have the church and the civic structures and the governments, things like that. And a lot of things follow from that. When you have a really good public plaza, you tend to have pretty good outdoor dining and all the other things that may come across as touristy, but except these plazas are, tend to be the oldest core of a city. And it has the capacity of entertaining people that are new to the town, but also providing the amenities that people have lived there for generations expect. So it's a good thing for a community to look at, what does it take to anchor that commitment to a space that is really there to serve the city first, not, private developers or residential or all the other things. And then the other one I just threw in there because why I like them, because I don't know, I'm a kid at heart, are train stations and airports. Kind of different, but airports are really incredible when you think of it as a singular thing. And maybe I should say train stations because it sounds more green. The capacity to handle a lot of people, the wayfinding, like all the amenities that are put in there, and the ability for people to arrive, get to where they're going, but still have a point where they can stop and learn about as much as they can on a given area as quickly as possible. And taking, for example, as airports grow, I'm not really keen on the shopping mall integration of airports, but when they do include some museum type aspect or some cultural amenity that, while you have the 2 to 12 hour layover, you can get a quick glimpse of what area you're in. So it's, again, I strive towards public spaces that have good wayfinding and capacity to flex with lots of people and down to when there's not too many people. And again, my plug is for, I think Luxembourg is the near perfect city in the world, but Amsterdam is an incredible second. And then Copenhagen, of course, is another great one. Great.
Thank you so much. Climate change is not a new thing, but we've been hearing a lot about it lately. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I was wondering, you guys that practice in the planning space, what changes have you seen in the last few years regarding planning for climate change? Bruce, I'm going to start with you this time.
We're having our 5th hurricane tonight for the season. That keeps you right on the edge of your seat. If you're in the Bay Area, you carry an N95 mask, not just for COVID, but from the fire smoke. So it's happening in real time. I think that's one of the things that the evidence for that is out in front right now. Some communities are progressive about it, and also they're in a precarious position, in terms of either they're dealing with sea level rise, you're Baltimore or New York, Eastern Seaboard, and the Gulf Coast. The whole coast is subsiding. So you have this combination of subsidence and sea level rise. Which means it's even more exciting when you get storm surge. And of course, the whole West Coast has another set of issues they're dealing with. And these in cities, depending on the risks they face, have to step up into that space. So we did work with colleagues on a plan for Estes Park, Colorado a few years ago, won an APA Colorado award for resilience. They had everything. It was forest fires, floods, invasive species, tourists. they had all these things that they had to deal with, and that whole wild urban interface that you're seeing in the West right now. They were very nervous about that, and they had to plan for that. So I think all of us, any city is doing true comprehensive planning now, is coming to terms with that. And particularly in the COVID space right now, people are because cities come back to some of the points that Jason's making. They're this tactile, experiential kind of environments, and that this is all this is interrupting that. So the joy of cities and the joy of community is being interrupted by this, and so most cities, I think, it's hard to find one that's not addressing that. Even Houston is doing a climate action plan. Amazing.
Great, thanks. Mike?
So, yeah, it's funny. I'm trying not to hesitate in answering, because to me it seems like when you have the smoke alarm going off in your house and everyone just chooses to ignore it, but the minute they smell smoke, then it's like, oh my God, the smoke alarm's going off. So I hate to think that we're now approaching, after Australia's wildfires, let alone the entire West Coast and everything else that's going on, it's becoming a little more apparent that there's some urgency. So the challenge is with the cities have been shouldering a lot of the burden. I remember it was probably like 5 years ago, I was in Miami visiting some friends and noticed that the city of Miami was raising all their roads and sidewalks. They took it upon themselves to address the issue that they agree is happening, and the sea level's rising. They weren't getting federal funding and assistance that I thought, wow, well, that's clearly a national level issue. And I would hope, because as planners, it's our duty to give leadership, as much information so that they can guide and have them make good decisions. It's challenging when your leadership wants to be selective in what they hear, and you can only provide stuff as factual, whether they choose to believe it. Then we just have to change the language. Then we have to just, in our case, we'll focus on more frequent flooding events, more frequent dust windstorm events, more frequent smoke and outcome from forest fires. So if we can at least get them to agree on the symptoms and they won't, vocalize the actual disease, then we'll proceed that way. I would argue, if given the opportunity, one thing I'd probably agree with our president, that I do believe forest fires, it is an issue of forest management, but then I would extend and say not just the forest, but also the oceans and everything in between. Since we've taken it upon ourselves to mess up the thermostat so bad, we now have to manage everything, whereas 100 years ago, it'd manage itself. Forests can easily overcome and adapt and get on just well without us, but it won't be a comfortable environment. And for the near impacts, for me, I have family in the Bay Area and Southern California who are now living with me and moving to Vegas. And I don't like, anecdote being the singular form of data, but if all my family from California are moving to see me in safe, life raft Las Vegas, that's an impact. So that's part of, we're going through our master plan. One of the first things we're anticipating is basically a climate refugee type approach. Vegas will have some impacts, but we won't have as drastic impacts regarding forest fires and hurricanes, but we'll have to adjust with more people moving to a desert community. How do we make sure that those things are provided? So probably throughout the session, I'll make a couple more plugs towards our 2050 master plan, but we do go into the supporting language without having to say this is a climate action plan, but this is how we're going to address all these issues that we expect to come from climate change.
Wow, great. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that as we go through the day. Samantha, what do you think about, what changes have you seen in the planning areas?
In the recent years, there's been definitely been a heightened awareness about how urban planning impacts climate change. There's a greater recognition that the way we build our communities has a direct impact on transportation. It has a direct impact on energy use, and therefore it directly impacts, our climate. And there's a recognition that urban form itself is at the heart of it to solve these climate change issues. Concepts such as transit-oriented development, walkability, mixed use, increased density, smart growth, which were once considered radical strategies, when I started my career, now they've become a norm. Not only for best design practices, but as best design practices to combat climate change. And they've become a norm, not just nationally, but also internationally, in recent years. When I started my career, like I said, we had to advocate for these principles. We had to educate our clients. We had to educate our consultants and the general public. But today, most communities are fundamentally built with these sustainable principles in mind, because awareness has increased and, our lifestyle preferences have changed too. People want to walk more to their services. And, as a result, we're also seeing, interventions like our streets are getting retrofitted to accommodate transit, to accommodate bikes, and, to establish a stronger pedestrian realm. And, with, like Bruce and Mike said, our cities and communities are seeing the effects of climate change right now, and, 70% of cities worldwide are dealing with some form of climate change. And, this awareness that climate change and urban form are related are translating into a lot of policy changes. California, we had the sustainable community strategy with, which was probably one of a kind, which actually aligned transportation, housing, and land use decisions towards achieving, greenhouse reductions. And these changes have been instrumental, for the urban planning field. Like Bruce said, more and more communities are adopting climate action plans, and the emphasis, has been on transit, the emphasis has been on walkability. And internationally too, there's been, a lot of changes in the urban planning field. I've worked extensively in China. China recently has mandated national policies, to include sustainable design strategies for their plans, like transit and mixed use and green systems have to be incorporated. I'm currently working in Vietnam on an urban growth strategy in Ho Chi Minh City, but again, the fundamental premise is that the urban growth strategy has to help combat climate change. Ho Chi Minh City is already witnessing the effects of climate change. They have severe flooding. It is also one of the most rapidly urbanizing cities in Vietnam. And, to add to that, 50% of the city is low-lying. So given all of these things, you would think the city already has like climate adaptation strategies from an urban planning point of view in their master plan, but they don't. But they have recognized it. They've recognized this correlation and, their update focuses on that. So, I believe as we continue to see the effects of climate change firsthand in our communities right now, and how we build our cities, the way we build our cities and how we grow will continue to take center stage in the coming years.
Great, thank you. All three of you guys are leaders in your own right. And I'm wondering if, since our audience includes a lot of architects and planners and landscape architects, and, what does climate change leadership look like? And how can we in the professions be better advocates? Let's start with you, Mike, because you kind of had started to talk a little bit about leadership.
So I think it's, I want to say unfortunate, it's reaching the point where we need bold leadership. And it's weird to commend whether it's forthright or not, but Xi Jinping, China's leader, to make a bold statement and commit to reducing their energy use and carbon footprint. Because I feel that my skill as a planner, I'm always pretty successful in convincing a leader that transit-oriented design will help pay for itself. It has other costs. It helps maximize development. It comes down to an economic argument, but then slowly try to steer it towards an argument of equity. And meanwhile, we're not really focusing on it's good for the long-term environment. So I think we're going to see in the next couple of years some bold leadership because people feel empowered to state the obvious. We're still in that strange stage where we have, a couple of council members and other elected leaders that want to hold out and see what the science has to say and things that they can drag their feet all they want, but as we build the plans, we'll just make the accommodations and call it something else. So I'd like to the point to be able to work a lot quicker and get to the point by just identifying what the obstacle is, what's the challenge, and then address it without having to play word gymnastics and do things that, economic arguments are wonderful, but they're just a component. They're just like, one side of the triangle. You're trying to look at, the long-term impacts to the environment. And then equity is really the big push for us as well. I mean, it's hard to say, if we succeed at curbing CO2 and becoming wizards at creating energy, but we still don't recognize a significant population of our own communities not getting access to their jobs, not getting fair pay. It's all kind of part of the giant component. It's challenging, but I guess the right thing tends to be the more challenging task.
Always is, isn't it? Sometimes it's hardest to do the right thing, even though it's the right thing. Bruce, what about this question?
Well, 7 years ago, I did a national survey with American Planning Association for every city that had an adopted climate action plan in the United States. And the number one, there's a number of questions about motivation for communities. Number one topic, reason for pursuing a climate action plan was political leadership, and primarily the mayor. And the mayors have been very important globally in terms of their networks and policy stances, which is important because 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from cities. But the managers for the action plans, 2/3 of them said that mayors were the most important reason why they even initiated a climate action plan. For us in the professions, I think our professions have been there for a while. I helped put together the STAT program at AIA. APA's been there. Engineering, ASHRI, and other folks have been sort of in the mix for some time. And our influence on policy making and implementing that is necessary. We're the professions that see the future that doesn't exist yet and provides directions in how to get there. And so we are quite used to working in the policy arena like Mike does every day. I'm working my 94th mayor right now in Southern California. So I'm a bit grizzled in the policy area. But our research that we all do on every project, in practice, sometimes we call it analysis, but research just means that you're starting with a question, right? And then project delivery, and in many cases, even beyond that, into operations. So we provide that full spectrum of what it takes. And as Samantha was saying earlier, you look at a climate action plan, if you use the C40 model, generally, about 45% of your emissions is from purchased energy, about 45% is going to be from transportation, and the mix else is waste and other things. And even that, it's not even a full accounting. My model looks at concrete being 13% of your emissions in a sprawl city. And so that's us. We have to be at the middle of the table for it to have an informed discussion. And it's key that we're there.
Great, Bruce, thanks. Samantha?
We need collective leadership, as Bruce and Mike said, governmental leadership is really important. This involves policy leadership at every level of government, national level, state level, regional, and local levels. And it's important for policies to be coordinated if meaningful changes have to take place. And I also want to stress the importance of a regional vision. Having worked on so many plans, I really think having a regional vision for future growth is absolutely critical because, communities, we don't exist in isolation, and we also don't grow in isolation. And so accommodating, future housing and jobs need to be looked at from that level. So in addition to government leadership at national and, within, nationally, we also need global leadership, where countries work collaboratively to make our cities more sustainable and to exchange ideas on how to make our cities more sustainable is very important. We also need technological leadership, where we invest in cleaner energies, we invent sustainable technologies that build our cities, that fuel our buildings and infrastructure networks. And again, like Bruce said, we need leadership from our professional. We need from our design and planning professionals, we need thought leadership. We should continue to come up with innovative strategies, to make our communities more and more sustainable. And we need to push for that and advocate for that. If you see an opportunities within our communities to make changes, we should. We also need leadership from the business world. Let's not forget that, we're seeing large corporations committing to sustainability, committing to lowering their carbon footprints. Tech companies like Google are, looking to expand in locations near transit, which is great. So we need leadership from, at every level, and we also need individual leadership. As citizens, we have the power to make informed choices, and these small changes can go a really long way. So collective leadership is very, very important, from an urban planning perspective.
That's fantastic. I've always thought too, as architects, we squeezed sometimes between our clients and regulations and things like that. We don't have to give in. We sometimes just fold over. And quite frankly, we have such strength in the numbers that we have as architects and planners and landscape architects who all believe similar things. And we should push harder on these agendas and make sure that because we're putting our name on these projects, they should be worth putting our name on, and they should be creating tomorrow's solutions, not tomorrow's problems. So I'd love to hear you guys talk about that. So I want to shift a little bit here. I got some specific questions for each one of you, and I'd like to kind of hear, and we have lots of time, so you don't need to rush these answers either. So. Bruce, can you explain a little bit about what you're doing at the University of Houston and how you're training the next generation of planners?
I'm committed to that. This is so a little bit of LBE, lead by example. So the students, every class I teach has a community partner, even if it's a drawing class. And so partly is there an engagement part of it, so that they're working outside the building. And this semester, I created the Quad Zero Studio. So in a semester, we put about a year's worth of studio into a semester. And we picked large scale projects. So this semester we're working in Texas City. So like a gas station by the sea. It's a, petrochem sort of place. So quite rough. Behind it has a levee. So it's somewhat protected from storm surge. And 98% of the greenhouse gas emissions for Galveston County come from Little Texas City. It is, if you can change Texas City, you can change anything. So, it's the Quad Zero Studio. So it's net zero water, waste, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions. And the students have to model it all. Many architecture students have never worked outside the lot line. They don't know the difference between a street and a right of way. So there's a sort of a steep learning curve for them to understand just the ingredients for city making and place making, because we have, very high design standards at the same time. So they did their midterm presentation yesterday, and which was interesting because 10 of my 13 students are women. So I put together a national class, all women jury for them, because you don't have to fly anybody now. You just do one of these, right? And so, Sam, you're on the list next time. And so then the second half of the semester, they have to do a net zero building in the context of their net zero master plan. And so what they learn is that it's a lot easier to think at a district scale, or as Sam's saying, it's easier to think about your city, because cities, are really part of an urban cluster quite often, right? And so that it's easier to get to net zero if you think at a district scale. And so they see the role each of their buildings will play in a very different way of looking at a city. And so they have to develop different ways of thinking about energy networks. They have to have, we talk about resilient strategies that they have to accommodate, so that, where's the feedback loop in this? What is it, modular? Where's the redundancies in this? How are you dealing with the diversity in this so that it's more resilient to different types of impacts? And it's so they get to exercise all of that in a semester, and it's quite a load. I would say it doesn't happen as often in our architecture programs as I'd hope. There's some shining lights nationally, but I've really been pushing that. Architecture 2030 and the building code is going to be there anyway. By 2030, they have to deliver a net zero building. And if you live in Samantha's neighborhood, that started this year. Everything in Berkeley is net zero. That was a Prop R or whatever it was 15 years ago. And it was, and now you can't even, they don't even let you pipe natural gas to a building in Berkeley now. It's got all the chefs kind of pissed off, but it's the next generation, in terms of how you look at communities. The students also understand where the big moves are when you look at a community scale in terms of emission reductions, and truly to mitigate it. So I have a lot of colleagues say, "Oh, heavy timber is going to save the world." It's mass timber, and if you model that on a community scale, it's like the 1% solution. It has very little contribution. Really, you start to look at, if you're really clever on materials in a building, it's a 30% reduction. It's 30% of some small amount. But if you put the building in the wrong place, and this is what Samantha's been talking about, you put it in the wrong place, now you're talking real numbers. Or if you're not, you don't start with intelligent passive strategies for a building or a district, then it's just uphill after that. And so these are the things that the students have to come to terms with, and we model it. It's all modeled. They're learning the language of climate action planning. So what's the baseline? What's the business as usual? What are some fundamental strategies to get to zero? And because I want them to be useful the first day at the office, because if they're working in architecture firm worth its salt, they're doing the architecture 2030 program, and if they're going to make a contribution, they need to understand the language of it. and basic strategies. That course I complement with a environmental analysis course. So I teach 5th year architecture students, the professional level courses, and I teach a vertical studio that includes grad students. I started a new master's program as a Master's of Science in Sustainable Urban Systems. So those students get tucked into that same studio, and they're required, they're core to take urban analysis course, which is an interdisciplinary course that I co-teach with a woman from College of Technology. So we're taking students that are used to working on stuff that's on the desktop, and they're out in the spring. We looked at air quality impacts from the Port of Houston, and we worked with local environmental justice groups. And then over the summer, we funded 3 of the students to continue to work on it. So we modeled, we looked at all the data from over 50 air quality sensors. We did an environmental justice overlay. I worked with a student on doing a pollution atlas for Houston. So it's a graphic summary of pollution and environmental justice layers for that. And now we're, you know, that's when the students then get to follow through on this. So I try to keep, you know, 3 or 6 students busy during the summer, actually following through on what comes out of the studios. And it's usually funded, you know, we get sponsors. So I'm not easy, and but I get a lot of repeat customers, and they just know how important this is. And you remember our students, it floods every year. That floods every year. Somebody in their family gets washed out every year. That's what's happening here, right? And so it's personal for them.
Yeah, boy, they are certainly lucky to have you as a professor, and those students, I'm sure, are in high demand in firms when they get out of school, because they understand both the design but the practical side of it too. So that's great.
Hey, Craig, while Bruce is on that topic, we did have a question, a question about Houston's flooding problems. So if you want to, can you speak just a little bit more on that before we?
Oh yeah, so you know, we're one big bayou, right? So there were actually 3 big watersheds with some smaller watersheds. And every time a storm passes over us, all these different watersheds, every storm has its own personality. Well, Harvey was just, you know, all these sub watersheds became one big watershed. I mean, we just, 4 feet of rain. I mean, how do you handle that, right? And so, but we get these other storms, even the one we had a couple of weeks ago, one of the Greek alphabet storms. And it was might have been the beta storm. I'm starting to lose count. We're storm 27 or whatever it is. And in Brays Bayou watershed, where I live, we just got a couple inches of rain at our end, but then in the upper reaches, there was 12 inches of rain in a day, right? A foot of rain a day. This is like three years worth of Las Vegas or something, right? You know, so look at a storm, we'll get San Francisco annual rainfall in 2.5 days, right? So just the amount of water. So there's no small scale solution. And as a region, we've taken the bayou system. So this is in urban analysis, we get to talk about biomimicry, you know, and so sometimes we'll model a watershed based on pre-development performance. And then I tell them, okay, in your plan, how do you mimic that? Right? So and there's a water quality piece of it, and you have to slow it down because the bayou system was really slow. Very curvy, slow, grassy, a lot of filtering. And then when we add all this impervious surface, which we have just a little bit in Houston, you know, Houston's like 634 square miles or something, right? And without a plan, just to make it exciting. And so how do you plan for that? Well, the engineers just speed it all up, right? So all the paving speeds it up. We straighten out the channels to make it go faster. And every time it hits a bump in the road, bang, 7 feet of water. So it's really, you can't stay out in front of it. It's like building freeway lanes. You just can't, you know, you're going to use it. unless you really think about the traffic first, right? And that's water. I don't know if this is useful, but that's a, you know, the Reader's Digest version. It's complicated.
Well, the scale of it is crazy. It's amazing. But I love the idea of the connection of biomimicry to the planning models.
Yeah.
I
So one of
think
my research projects right now, Jason, is looking at a 143-acre landfill site as a detention and redevelopment facility. So I got 3 students working on that, and it's funded by a local redevelopment agency. And you're trying to fix everything through a remediation program. But those are the big sites that are left that you can do, you know, any meaningful detention on.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Bruce.
Oh, thanks. Samantha, I know you started to answer this question kind of as part of the first one, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more. So you've worked a lot internationally, and I'm wondering, you know, our audience would be interested in hearing, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing for internationally?
You know, I'm going to give a China example because I've worked extensively there. So, you know, in many projects that I've worked within existing communities, and many of these communities have, you know, what are called these super blocks, which, you know, have these really hostile pedestrian environment, and they're completely, you know, not conducive to walking, and they really don't have human scale. So, you know, one of the strategies was, you know, to introduce what we called auto-free streets, to break up these blocks and to improve connectivity, to create more direct routes, to create more human scale, and to also increase public space. And China now has a national policies where they are mandating these super blocks to be actually broken down, you know, with public paths or auto-free paths. And this strategy, you know, I think could be used anywhere in the world. You know, this idea of pedestrian only or pedestrian and bike only could be adopted even within our communities. You know, one example is right here. You know, I live in a block, and mid-block there is a greenway that opened up a few years ago, and it has been such an asset to the community, especially during the pandemic. And this concept, you know, is also being used in Barcelona, where Barcelona is experimenting with converting some of their internal streets to encourage biking and walking and to cut through traffic. So this is one, you know, this example of pedestrian paths is I think is a best practice that is applicable to any community anywhere in the world. And to move on to a larger scale, I think investing in transit. You know, China has huge investments in transit, and as a result, their transit network is so robust. You know, they have like high-speed rail, metro, BRT, bike sharing programs. And so every community, you know, I've planned in China has had some form of transit investment, and this is again due to a national policy. You know, China has a policy where, you know, they stipulate transit share for cities based on their type. So, you know, again, you know, investing in transit, you know, will really take us a very far way to combat climate change. You know, there are other best practices, you know, like sponge cities concept, where we have a sustainable drainage system. Bruce spoke about, you know, it a little bit just now. And so sponge city concept, again, could be used anywhere in the world. It, you know, increases our pervious percentage. It helps combat climate change, you know, helps reduce floods. And, you know, so these are some of the best practices that, you know, that I think are useful. There are many, many more, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to wrap up with these 3.
Yeah, those are great. I as you were talking about that, I kept thinking of the Las Vegas Strip, and you talk about a super block, and I sure wish it had more transit, had more walkability, and it had fingers that would connect in between. But maybe we'll get there someday. I keep hoping. Hey, Mike. So what's the city of Las Vegas planned right now to address climate change? I know you've been working hard on a lot of things, and maybe you can share a little bit. You're muted, Mike.
Sorry, I was trying to be, I had sirens going and then I forgot about it. A lot of it comes back to, and I think what I mentioned, like, I don't want to say the word play, but identifying the issues and then calling it something else. So for the city of Las Vegas, I'll give a quick recap. We have the draft 2050 master plan. This will be my quick plug. Anyone on there, they want to jot down, if you put in masterplan.vegas, you'll be able to access a draft of that plan. And real quickly, I would recommend read the whole thing. It's pretty thick, but focus on the land use, chapter 2, and then chapter 3, the environment. Our approach is looking at land use, like planners love to do, and looking at the impact that has on climate change and pretty much the relationship of everything. My 2-second summary of this next 30-year master plan is it's an infill development plan. We're really focusing on a lot of key related things. So we have, I won't say the mass failure of retail anchors, but I don't know any of that are succeeding very well. We know a lot of these shopping centers that have the large retail anchors are struggling, vacant, or failing, happen to be on high traffic intersections, which are perfect locations for mixed use, mixed income type of developments. So we're looking at altering the land use and having, we have a form-based code for the downtown plan area, but we're looking at a similar context-driven TOD-based plan, zoning code for these new areas. So we identified all of our major arterials, the Charlestons, Ranchos, Saharas, and to really put the emphasis that those are redevelopment corridors, that we can solve a lot of problems by putting in a transit system that works, that then helps address inequitable access to workplace and equitable housing. It helps us tie a lot of these little things together. And I don't want to get too off track because there was something that Samantha brought up that I thought was brilliant, but I'll remember to hit it again. But in regards to this master plan, we use the term resiliency because that's where we're at now. I think we've passed the ability to correct climate change, so now we have to learn how to live with events. And so events may be more man-made and driven, like the horrific October 1 event. Who's to say with how much more strange domestic terrorism and outside pressures that we have to deal with, but also I was kind of not in jest, but Las Vegas is going to be a climate refugee hotspot. Kind of seeing it as I speak now. So how we handle that is going back to scale. So Las Vegas is divided into 6 wards with a mayor. This plan, and it's funny when I'm saying these are like noble steps, but as like a planner or policy wonk, they are. We've divided our city into 16 planning areas that are based on more unique aspects that they have in common with each other than trying to put a blanket plan across the city. So we start with these 16 planning areas that then scale down and have a component of a resiliency plan. So we start looking at community centers. Naturally, the primary objective is to provide classrooms, activities, recreational aspects for the community, but then have the flexibility if they have to be a shelter, if they have the capacity to serve a neighborhood for an event, because we're learning that that's what happens. And sometimes if you have to count on ad hoc shelters, you can quickly become overwhelmed, as we learned with coronavirus. So resiliency is kind of the code language to how we plan and adjust for, I would say, climate-related anticipated events. And then having that scaled 16 plan area division where we can break up and get into a more context-driven response. Some land uses are different. Those that are familiar with Las Vegas, the far northwest of Las Vegas is considerably different demographically than the far east side of Las Vegas. Just 2 totally separate communities. We need to be able to respond differently. based on design, equity, funding, different focus on how we handle transportation. I mean, the Northwest, our greatest success will probably be, express shared ride transit stations, where in the far east side of Las Vegas, we need a full deployed mixed income transit oriented development to help offset household costs. So, which was funny is when we started the plan, we had this approach. We wanted to have a very simplified 90-page, highly graphic document that was easy for anyone to pick up and absorb and get on point to what the city was trying to do, what those issues were. And I still strive that that's what we're trying to do, but we're taking on so many issues that we can't ignore, that the document, it is broken up in sections, but it's pretty thick because we are trying to have an honest conversation of what's the city's actual role. In the past, not to demean Las Vegas, but our role was, provide a couple parks per 1,000, put some roads so people can get to work, and generally call it good. Keep the neighborhoods where they're at and keep the business and retail where they're at, and that's a plan. Well, we now realize education's a big component we don't have direct control over, but as planners, we're responsible for building communities, and people choose the communities they live in based on the education that's available. So we have to help close that loop. Transportation, that's a big deal for us. We have a downtown urban environment that's really succeeding, but until we have an actual high capacity transit system of whatever form, if it's the Boring Company's loop system, if it's gondolas, if it's whatever the form is, we still need to have people arrive not in cars. That's just the basic fact. The magic of, if you want a walkable community, can't have everyone drive, get out, park, and put it somewhere. Parking garages are a wonderful Band-Aid, but you have to have these things put in place that a plan will support. So the other component of this plan and how we look to execute it, the other thing we've learned is things change too quickly. So we have a 30-year plan. We have the full anticipated adjustments, all these anticipated problems and issues we're trying to deal with and drill down. But we're going to do it in a 2-year cycle. Every 2 years, we have to go through the plan and see where we're hitting and align it with our strategic plan. These are things that probably sound obvious, but we hadn't been doing in the past. Is the city would have a strategic plan that would always identify a key issue, but it didn't always align with the master plan. And kind of as a civics 101 issue, that's a big deal, because as we were doing the outreach with the master plan, I would go out to the community and tell them, there's really 2 key moments while living in the city that you have a pretty direct say. That's when you go vote, and that's when you go to a community meeting and tell us what you want to see in your master plan. I mean, those are the 2 full contact levels of engagement in your community. And when that master plan is adopted, that's really the guiding document for your elected leaders to follow. That's what's going to determine where the funding and attention goes. And so I think people are now realizing that fact, and that they try to use that for leverage to argue that, we went to the meetings, we identified these issues, and as elected leaders, you guys need to stay on top of that. Kind of jumping back, and I'm sorry if I'm like hopping all over the place, but with those 16 area plans, they're built off the American Community Survey. So we're taking better, more high fidelity information that doesn't change over time. So the problem that we've always had in the past is when you let elected leaders as a ward representative just focus on their wards, it can be good for their constituents, but it's not always good for the community, because then you have funding battles, you have disparities like we have the odd wards versus the even wards. We're having issues that shouldn't exist, but they're our urban core wards versus our outer suburban wards. And so now we're trying to break that up a bit and just say, look, we're going to focus on these 16 areas. There will be some overlaps, but the thing is we need to go back and be able to consistently measure the changes of these areas, and the items that we have that have the best fidelity are the American Community Survey, the block census areas. Because it's important. We have to have good, consistent measurements to show that we're making changes. And that's kind of where I want to jump back, not so much on the master plan, but what Samantha brought up is within the plan, it's my goal, you know, we're trying to cover so many things, is when you have a really good, easily understood vision statement and you align an indicator with it, you have great public success. And what I'm trying to get to real quickly is when I was in Copenhagen, I realized if you travel through all over Europe, you know, the cities that have canals, it's such a wonderful thing, but a lot of the canals are kind of gross. You get to Copenhagen, they're clean enough, people are swimming in them. And I was talking to some people, and they're like, yeah, they intentionally made a very clear statement, let's make our canals clean enough to swim in. So you can see the bottoms, it's a very unique experience. And then it reminded me of, you know, Keep Tahoe Blue. It's something that's so easy for people to understand. It's either blue or it's not. You can either see 70 feet down or you can't. And you understand the direct connection. If Lake Tahoe is no longer blue, then something wrong is going on in the system. And so that's what we're trying to keep, you know, within the plan, clearly understood indicators. So I talk about the infill development focus of the plan. One of our climate aspects, and I'm trying to treat this with the most respect, that it's not a weird Band-Aid. It's a tree planting plan. We put a heavy focus on tree planting, you know, urban coverage, because we're greatly reduced in our canopy coverage than we've ever been in the past, which has contributed with, you know, asphalt surface parking and all the other things. But then going back to a practical sense of, you know, we used to have a lot of trees. Why don't we have trees? And so a deep scrub in our policies. We don't have the most tree-friendly development code. We don't have the most tree-friendly supporting language for our street trees. So we're going through, and then also realizing, and this gets down to the details, you can grow a decent range of trees in the desert, but you have to have very specific details on how you support that. So we're looking at, you know, having that strategy of appropriate soil volumes, appropriate, you know, soil cooling, and then knowing which trees, unfortunately, in the next 10 to 20 years aren't going to do well. I love pine trees, but they're kind of on our not going to do well list. There's a couple other trees that may be drought resistant, but we're getting high temperature days that are extending that'll reach the point that certain foliage won't survive. So we're adjusting and adapting, you know, our tree and shrub plant plans. So it's trying to take on a lot of things, and then hidden in there is, you know, having a 2-year cycle to do it in manageable chunks.
Wow.
Yeah, I hope I wasn't like all over the place.
No, it's good. You have a tough job, man. I will remember that next time I come down and talk to you, and treat you a little more respect about that. Yes, you have a really tough job, and especially dealing with all the policy makers that you deal with.
Yeah.
Guys, we are about out of time, but we have a ton of questions. Can I impose you guys for 10 more minutes to answer a few questions? We have some really good ones.
I've seen some answers to some of the questions that were to me.
Yeah.
So they're dealt with. I think part of the open-ended ones, I think that we all might be able to contribute to, is there's the equity question. There's a couple questions on equity, and there's another one about, I mean, what is a net zero carbon environment, right? So these are two open questions. So I suggest you pick one or both of those and give us 2 minutes.
All right.
Well, first, Bruce, thank you for doing the typed answers, and anyone's viewing can
just
check those out now. So thank you. If we have 10 minutes, if we're going to go 10 minutes, I just want to, Mike, there was another question for you. And I think this has to do with, you mentioned earlier about climate refugees and coming to Las Vegas and Southern Nevada, which, you know, historically, we've been one of the fastest growing urban areas for the longest time. And how much capacity do we really have in the desert environment, and in terms of climate refugees.
So, right, and that's a good regional planning question. So within the plan, within the limits of Las Vegas, the city of Las Vegas, we anticipate, you can put me on the spot, it's in the plan, it's in the draft, but 330,000 additional Las Vegas residents. That being met with a heavy focus on infill development. We will not be able to meet that capacity doing what we did the past 20 years with some adjustments and, changes in behavior regarding water use and land use that reduces water use. So we're looking at 3 to 5 story mixed use, higher density residential living than single family homes with front lawns and backyard pools. We can meet that. That's us taking care of our part, but it's a regional issue. I mean, we work closely with Henderson and North Las Vegas and Clark County, but we're trying to do the right, and I'm not saying this in just to the other cities, we're trying to do the right thing by identifying our boundaries and staying within them.
Thank you. I think there's probably one big question that was asked, and Bruce's answer is I can run a tape on that, which I think this could go into a long answer, but maybe could we think about a short answer for each of you on the how urban planning can address decarbonization or net zero carbon environment. So look from a urban planning perspective, how do we decarbonize our cities?
So in Houston, if we reduce our VMT, so about 48% of our greenhouse gas emissions using the C40 model is transportation. About 89% is on-road personal transportation. 70% is gasoline-fired cars. I mean, when you start to come down to it, and we're kind of a sprawling place. So if we reduce our VMT by 20%, it'll be less than Portland, right? So we are, yeah, I know. Mike went, really? Yes, that's true. And so the challenge is not just, there's only 3 things you can do. You can reduce VMT. So all the cool things we've been talking about, we love about walkable cities, high passive performance cities, that only gets you a percentage. We have to do the transition. I've helped create a group called Evolve that's looking at regional infrastructure for EV. And so the other 2 things is fuel and technology. So I did the policy modeling for the Houston Climate Action Plan, and I ran all the numbers on this and to show us how we can get down to a 70% below baseline impact from our fleet. But we still need 8.6 miles of West Texas desert for PV to fuel it. So in some cases for us, it may not look as different as some of us might like, but we have to make the commitment to the fuel switch. And in a state that's just one big gas station like Texas, we have a local policy is easier than the state policy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Samantha, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So, it's all the strategies that we discussed over the past hour, to put it in a perspective, like Bruce said, in the US, transportation and buildings together account for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So changing the way we move is critical, reducing our VMT, going to cleaner fuels, and changing our urban form, making our cities more walkable, bikeable, and sustainable infrastructure. How are we fueling our cities and infrastructure networks? All of these together would get us to reducing our carbon emissions and getting us to net zero.
Thank you. And Mike, you discussed the city's strategy for trees and vegetation. Is there anything else you want to add on to that?
Yeah, it's just like tying in the whole part that Bruce and Samantha brought up. When we say transportation, the focus on transit-oriented design, because you want a mass transit system that has a capacity to carrying a lot of people with a lower energy load. but then the impact it has on the environment, but then it also has the impact on equity and other things that follow. When you can reduce a household income by putting their form of transportation to get to work and school right next to their house, and then their auxiliary transportation or bikes and walking, it really becomes, you know, the one thing that just has multiple benefits. It's tricky because one of the challenges that comes with that, you know, we have we're looking for higher density transit systems and higher density living. And oh, by the way, we have COVID where everyone wants to get the hell out of the city and never ride a subway again. So it's like, you know, each time you get something that really looks like a strategy, we have to adjust and figure out what's the new focus. What are the issues we deal with? Are they behavioral or things that we can adjust? But it does go back. I think the biggest changes are where the energy is used, and it's buildings, and we reduce that by having more people in denser buildings that transit-oriented development does, and then reducing burning fossil fuels for cars. Now, the quick part that I want to bring up is we're looking at high capacity transit and all these systems we're trying to put in place. One of the challenges is, you know, we have the transit or the TNCs, the Ubers and Lyfts, which really makes it hard to justify doing a high capital project like a light rail when they can say, well, if everyone's using Uber and Lyft, and it's like, that is convenient and that is great, but if people understand the impact, that's still cars on the road. So until then, you know, if it goes to electric cars, that's great, but it'll still have an impact on walking. It'll still have an impact. It's not that I'm a super train fan, but nothing beats moving thousands of people at a time within a day. And then we'll have to figure out the puzzle. How do you keep those thousands of people safe while you're doing that?
Absolutely. Well,
Thank
guys, I so appreciate you spending a little extra time with us. I just want to close with the last question and really short, quick soundbite answer. What's the one thing we should be doing here in Las Vegas Valley? Bruce?
Net zero water.
Samantha?
Build inward, upward transit. And trees, you know, Mike, you know, he touched upon a very, very important topic. Maximize tree coverage. It helps with urban heat island issues. And, you know, with Las Vegas being one of the fastest warming cities in the United States.
Mike?
So yeah, learn to love the idea of living in Las Vegas for the rest of your life. You don't have to, but just let it sink in your head that you might stay here, so you should care about some of the consequences.